Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be the last video in our journey to the Overland OSR review. So the last time we left off at character combat. So see if we can get there. Now, character combat begins on page 122, and I think of all the sections in the rules for people that have purchased the game and actually tried to play it, I get more questions, and I wouldn't say so much questions as inquiries about the character combat. So people understand the character combat, but I don't think they understand why character combat works the way it does. Now, I told you guys earlier that the game uses a percentile dice. So if you have an 80% ability score and you're using a +7 sword, you'd have an 80% chance of hitting a opponent in combat. And vice versa, they would have a similar chance with you. Normally, your opponent's statistics are not going to affect your chance to hit them unless they do what is called a defensive action, in which case they actually get a roll, just a random roll. It's modified by any defensive equipment, whether it's a shield or normally a shield or sometimes a helmet. And then that's subtracted from your attack. So typically if somebody chooses to defend, it will greatly reduce your chance of hitting them. But they have to give up their attack entirely in order to do a defense. So, and plus in this game, you can only do a defense every other round of combat. So if you do a defense in the first round, the second round, you can't do it. You have to wait again until the third. And that's basically to keep games from dragging where someone's just rolling defense every turn and you got like a 20% chance of hitting them. And it's also kind of in sync with the purpose or the illustration of defense in this game, in that in this game, when you're defending, it's almost like running, dodging. So if you ever watch the TV shows where they run and the guy ducks and the dude swings and knocks over a bookshelf, and then he jumps on the table and the guy kicks the table out from under him, then he rolls to the other side of the room. That's what defense is in this game. So it's not so much the defense like in a pitched battle where you're raising the shield, clang, and your sword clangs with his sword, clang. That's more of he's attacking, you're attacking, and you're both going back and forth. In this game, defense, if you wanted to represent it visually, would be that kind of running around, running from his weapon, dodging, throwing dirt in his face, all these little nicky-knack tricks that you're doing to keep this guy from hitting you whatsoever. And that's why I only let you do it every other round, because you really can't maintain something like that over the course of an entire combat, before sooner or later the guy's going to corner you, catch up with you, or get a blow in, or you're going to get tired and you're going to have to kind of stop or stand there or raise your sword. And plus, like I said, it keeps the combats from dragging out. So now that part I think most people understand is straightforward. You can evade out of combat, which is probably one of the things that people rarely utilize, that tell me they got killed in the first combat. And I say, well, did you evade? Well, they never answer that question either. Because if you're just starting out, it is a good idea to evade in a combat. And normally you can evade whenever you want. There are some combats where it will state you cannot get away. And that's just usually the nature of your opponents or where you're at or what happens. But normally you can always choose an evade action. So this is kind of the basic weapons table here. And again, you have your modifier. All weapons do a fixed amount of damage. But there are certain skills that will increase the amount of damage you can do. But normally it's going to be a fixed amount of damage. So that's probably not very D&D. If you're into the D&D where you have the chance to do critical damage, or as you get stronger you get extra dies and stuff, that's not really how this game is played. Although there are skills that let you do extra damage, and in the rules I'm writing now, there will be a chance to do critical damage. Now, one of the things I think the best way to explain kind of how this combat system derived is to show you what I drew on. And that's this book here, or this game system. And this is called Lone Wolf. So if you've ever heard of the Lone Wolf series by Joe Deaver and Gary Chalk, this is what people are referring to. And if you look in here, you play it. This is like kind of a pick your own adventure book. You have a combat record and you have endurance points. Just like in my game, I use endurance points. And then you have, let me get to this part. You have your weapons table, right? And so he has kind of this selection of weapons. He has his skills he can get, Mind Shield and Mind Blast, which is a thing where I got the Mind Marker ability for my native Overlanders from. He has food rations, 2 meals. You have to eat food. I think that's kind of where I got that from in my game. Is in my game you're required to eat meals. And I do tell people when you are thinking about buying the game that it was inspired by Lone Wolf. It was inspired by Barbarian Prince and the Dragon Quest game. But anyway, to give you an idea of kind of how the combat works, if you're in this game and you have combat, you actually roll for yourself as well as the enemy. And for the most part, what the book will simply say is, you know, you are attacked. If you survive the attack, you know, turn to this page. Okay, right here. It says you prepare your weapon and advance to meet the enemy. There are 2 mountain Geeks and you must fight them one at a time. So you have their combat skill and their endurance. And it says if you win, turn to 291. Now there's nothing else, because if you lose, you're dead. But there's no AI, you know, oh, this one is going to attack you from the left and this one is going to use his other bow or his other axe. It's just, here's their stats, fight them, right? And in Journey to the Overland, that's kind of how the combat works. You will encounter the creatures or characters or monsters through the game cards, and when you do that, you simply fight them. Right, I don't have a bunch of AI in here. I mean, I'm playing around with it in a limited degree. But for the most part, there isn't really an AI. Now, if you are into AIs, like from games like Gloomhaven and things like that, then the closest thing is what I call the optional facing rules. Excuse me, and combat supplement. And this you will actually set up on a hex sheet, and it basically will give you instructions for how the how your opponent will move and how you will move around him to try to gain an advantage in that combat. So for example, here it says the NPC will move toward your character's front, right? Or it says here the NPC faces you frontward. And most of that is random, other than the way I weighted the numbers. But what they actually do is random, but it's weighted so that normally they're going to try to face you frontward. They're not going to let you get their back. But if you are able to get their back, or you are able to get on the side of them, then you do additional damage. And that's in that table there. And that's what's called the optional combat facing rules. Now, You can do this on the regular map, which is a hex map, but I always recommend that somebody get like a hex sheet or another type of hex surface and simply do it on there. That way you don't kind of mess up where you were at in gameplay. But you can do it on the map, but I do tell people, remember, if you do use the map, how you move around during the optional combat has no bearing on where you are actually at in the game. And again, this is a mechanic that people get confused about. They're like, well, if I can only move 2 hexes a day and I get into a combat and I've already moved, can I move in that combat? And I'm like, yes, because moving in a combat is not the same as traveling for the day. You may move several times in a combat, especially if you're using the optional combat rules. You're going to move every round, right? That has nothing to do with traveling. Moving in a combat is simply positioning yourself, trying to get behind a guy, stepping to your left, stepping to your right. Traveling is actually a journey you're taking that day. So those two, neither one has any bearing on the other. And again, this is not a new mechanic. This is not some weird thing I came up with. I got this out of Dragon Quest. Okay, and this is Dragon Quest. Okay, some of you may have seen it. This is one of the revised editions. The first one had a guy holding up a big dragon's head. But this is Dragon Quest, and if you see here, they show you the melee zone, rear, front, and so forth. This is where I came up with the optional combat rules. And Dragon Quest is a role-playing game. Okay? It was an award-winning role-playing game. So this is not a new concept that you are going to play out a game on a hex map and you are going to actually do the combat on the hex map. And it just said here, whenever combat has been determined, that the GM set it all up for the players. Well, in my game, because it's a solo game, you have to set it up for yourself. But it's not impossible to figure out. Again, here's some diagrams of characters in a hex map. Now, in Dragon Quest, you had to do it this way because that's the way the game outlined it. In my game, I made it optional. So in Journey to the Overland, you don't have to use that. You don't have to do the whole hex thing. You can simply take your character stats, take your opponent's character stats, and you keep rolling and attacking until one of you is dead. But you got to use common sense, okay? Sometimes an enemy may have more than one weapon, and you're going to have to use common sense as to which one he would use in a situation to attack you with. I mean, that's part of the fun of a solo game, in my opinion, is you have your imagination and your common sense. It's just like when you're a child and you're playing with your toys. I mean, you have to use your imagination, right, as to how the enemy would react or where the enemy is going to do. But that kind of adds to the fun of it. You know, nowadays people get offended if you tell them they have to, you have to use your common sense or your own imagination. This gets us to the section of the game that deals with war. And by war, we're simply referring to combat involving troops. And so you see here, there's some information on using troops. There's some information on battles with troops. And again, I think this was kind of taken more from a lot of the old Avalon Hill games. Divine Right, I know that was one of them. I think they used troops. I think there was War of the Ring. They used counters and troops. And so it was kind of a mix. And I think Knights of Camelot may have even used counters and troops, where it was a mix of role-playing and counters. And that's kind of what you have here. The troop actually combat, though, is quite easy because when you are attacking with your counters, you will roll on the troop attack table, and then you will roll on the troop defense table. And it's very simple like that. You don't need numbers on the counters. There's no real big difference between infantry and cavalry. I think they get bonuses depending on what you're doing. But other than that, everything is resolved in this table. As we get past that, there's kind of a blurb here on setting up kingdoms in the game and the different kingdoms that are represented. There's this section on strategic locations, and this is just telling you about some places on the map that are not really germane to gameplay, but they have functions in the game. And then we get to the back of the book, and we kind of start to get into some of the additional scenarios. This is some more stuff on troops, artillery, pikemen, and these are optional units that you can field. But like I said, now we get to the back of the book, which is called The Other Realms. And The Other Realms talks about basically a lot of the other scenarios or objectives you can go for in the game. This is the Dragon's Home, where I mentioned earlier. So this section deals with the dragon Valron and his attacks. This is called Yeti Mountain. It deals with the Yeti. And in this game, the Yeti or the Sasquatch live in this kind of frozen mountain realm. And right now, they're kind of like, they're kind of like out of favor with the king. Because basically, the king at one time was involved in a war, and he sent for help from Yeti Mountain, and they didn't come. But there was a reason they didn't come, which was because they had already sheltered the king and taken devastating losses, keeping an orc horde from getting to him. And once the king was recovered by his own forces, and he later sent for them toward the end of the war, they didn't come because they were depleted. But ever since then, the Yeti have been anathema in the Overland, and in fact, they're the only race that you can force to fight in the Overland arena. And so that brings us to the Overland arena and the fight sequence for using Yetis in the Overland arena, which is why they're fought in the arena. It's sort of like the king paying them back. This talks about Dead Man's Ditch, which is a location on the map, the Unknown Islands, which is a location on the map, but it's also the subject of a supplement that is going to be published soon, where you can actually go to the Unknown Islands. They have their own kind of weather on the island, which is different, so you would actually roll on this weather table than the normal cards. The Darkman's Domain is another kind of enigmatic area in the game. It's a part of the map that's darkened because really no light shines in that part of the kingdom. This is where the native overlanders was kind of like their primary land, their primary homeland, and it was destroyed in a great war. It was cursed by a wizard, and that's why it's all ultimately dark now, except for this one location called the Oracle of Light. And that's what this talks about. If you make a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Light, there's a possibility that you will be given some type of blessing or power. The arena, again, these are more instructions on the arena. So the other section dealt primarily with fighting Yeti in the arena. This section of the arena rules deals with just if you want to fight in the arena voluntarily. Knighthood. So this section explains how you would become a knight, which is what I mentioned, I think, in the first video with the Knights of the Land. This is called the Dragon Slayers. These are all dwarves who specialize in killing dragons. And this is if you wanted to join the Dragon Slayers, how you would have to go about that. The scenarios and the training that's involved in becoming a Dragon Slayer. And then eventually it tells you the skills and abilities you learn as a Dragon Slayer. After that, I think we got the Samurai. You can become a part of the Order of Samurai by going to Morsh Monastery. And that lays out how you become a samurai and then some of the skills of the samurai that you will pick up if you become a samurai. And the last section deals with a character called the Pathfinder. And the Pathfinder is kind of like this mythical elf warrior who you can go to him if you need aid with some very, very grave or very important task. But there's a price to pay if you do that, right? There's a price to pay in the sense that you become indebted to him as the Pathfinder. And most of these are called special orders, as in knightly orders or orders of warriors. And if you join one, normally you cannot join the other, right? So if you are a knight, you cannot be a dragon slayer. If you are indebted to the Pathfinder, you cannot be a knight, and so forth, because those orders involve sacred oaths, and you can't have, you know, an oath to more than one lord or liege or body or organization. But that's about it, everybody. That's the first edition of Journey to the Overland. Hopefully that answered a lot of questions you had about the game, including some of its origins. And take care. God bless.